The case history is part of this piece. I mean, probably the greatest challenge that Mark and I started talking about from day one, and then Jennifer when she came on board, was figuring out how we could deliver what is basically a general, abstract, and universal argument about the nature of the corporation as an institution, and yet at the same time produce a work that dealt with the tangible, on-the-ground kinds of things that were happening within the corporate world. How can we both be general and specific at the same time? How can we put case histories forward and still keep the viewer, or keep the reader in the case of my book, mindful of the more general, more universal, more structural concerns that we're looking at? And we went back and forth on how to do that. We worked very hard to choose case studies that would have a shelf life and to contextualize them in such a way that it would be clear that these were just case studies, that, you know, in terms of the example of sweatshops in Honduras, this wasn't a film about sweatshops in Honduras. The example of sweatshops in Honduras was being used to illustrate more general structural dimensions and imperatives of the corporation. And that's why we came up with this device of sort of this moving cursor kind of thing, where we look at different potential case studies and then we zero in on a few. And graphically, the idea behind that is to really illustrate that you could take almost anything. You could look at almost any example to illustrate the same points. It just so happens that we've chosen these examples. And needless to say, the examples that we chose were chosen for reasons of their illustrative power, but also for reasons, much more practical reasons of could we get access to the people we needed, could we get archive, all of those kinds of things. And in the book I had considerably more freedom, because in a book you don't have to get archive, you don't have to shoot anybody, you can rely on secondary sources, you can rely on other people's interviews. And so in the book there are certain examples. For example, I focus on British Petroleum as a central case study. I focus on Pfizer as a central case study. I focus on the exploding Chevy Malibu story, General Motors, as another case study. And none of these stories are in the film. And there are stories in the film that aren't in the book. And I like that, because I think what it does is that the person who reads the book and sees the film is getting fundamentally the same kind of structural analysis, the same point of view, the same thesis, the same arguments, and is able to see it through different illustrations. So the two don't completely repeat each other, but actually complement each other in that way.
People in Bangladesh who are starving to death, the people in China who are starving to death, and the only thing that they have to offer to anybody that is worth anything is their low-cost labor.
You know, this argument that's made by Michael Walker at the Fraser Institute, people are always, you know, did he really say that? I mean, did he believe that? Did he believe that you know, people in the developing world are sort of happily inviting these big companies in to exploit them and pay them slave wages? How could he possibly believe that? And I think, you know, I say the same thing to myself, but it's surprising how many economists and how many people in the mainstream of sort of economic and policy thinking believe that it is a great benefit for to go over to developing world countries and pay people you know, basically subsistence wages in order to get work done that they'd be paying a lot more for if they were buying labor in their home countries. You have to admit there is a sort of a surface plausibility to the argument. I mean, if the choice for a person in Honduras is between starving and working for Nike or for Walmart or for whomever at subsistence wages, the argument is, well, at least they're subsisting. And I think that a lot of people are persuaded by that idea. The problem with that argument, though, is that it has absolutely no moral content. you could make exactly the same argument about slavery, and people did. People justified slavery in the U.S. South and in other contexts as being actually kind of beneficent, that the people who became slaves were starving in Africa, and at least as slaves, they were getting, maybe one meal a day. They weren't starving. And that's a pernicious argument, and it's just as pernicious when you put it in the context of companies going into places where people are so desperate that they have no choice but to work for what are effectively slave wages. And so I think it's very important to challenge that surface appeal of the argument and to ask, well, maybe now they have a bowl of rice a day, but what is the moral content of saying that it's okay to exploit somebody, to exploit the hell out of somebody, so long as they're slightly better off than if you don't exploit them? If we accept that principle, then we potentially will build a world that's based on slavery and serfdom.
Well, the whole idea of the export processing zone is that it will be the first step towards this wonderful new development. Through the investment that's attracted to these countries, there will be a trickle-down effect into the communities. But because so many countries are now in the game.
Central ideas in this project, one of the animating ideas is the notion that the corporation is a psychopath. And I think this idea is often misunderstood. I mean, people say, oh, that's an inflammatory idea, calling corporations psychopaths. But I actually see it as a quite cool, analytical, precise analytical metaphor, in the sense that, I mean, when I was in psychology, Psych 101, and I did psychology as my major, I learned that a psychopath was a person who was incapable of feeling concern for others, who was incapable of feeling remorse or guilt when they did bad things, and who had no sort of internal sense of, no moral sense of obligation to obey the law or to obey social conventions. When I went to law school and I was in Law 101 or Corporations 101, I learned that a corporation, firstly, that a corporation was a person, and secondly, that it was a person who was legally required always and only to serve its own self-interest. And it was sort of around that idea that time that I got this idea that, well, if a corporation's a person, it really is a psychopathic person, because here we've created, through the law, this artificial person that lacks the capacity, the ability to be concerned about others, to feel guilt or remorse, to feel morally obliged to obey the law. It has all of the attributes of a psychopath. And so that became, relatively early on in this project, that became a kind of organizing principle, an organizing idea, and it serves that purpose in both the book and the film. And I think it's an idea that has generally, in reviews of both the book and the film, is generally been very well received, because I do think it's very accurate. And I think we as a society really have to ask the question of why we have first created the institution in this way, but second, that we continue to give it more and more power over our lives, despite its psychopathic character. And that's really the question that I want people to walk out of this film and finish the book and ask themselves. Because right now we're living in a historical period where the dominant sense of the way we should be proceeding in terms of policy is we should be deregulating corporations, giving them more freedom, letting them regulate themselves. We should be privatizing more of our world, handing over to corporations our public services. We should be commercializing more of our world, allowing commercial and corporate values to dictate more of our choices. We should be lifting restrictions on mergers and acquisitions among corporations, allowing them to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And it seems to me this is insane, that if this institution is indeed psychopathic, which I believe it is, why are we freeing it from democratic constraints? Why are we handing over the very sinews of our society and in our public services and our public realm? And why are we allowing it to get bigger and more powerful? That seems to be the wrong direction.
more, industry has known about this, at least most industries have known about this, and have attempted to trivialize these risks. If I take a gun and shoot you, that's criminal. If I expose you to some chemicals which knowingly are going to kill you, what difference is there? The difference is that it takes longer to kill you. We are now in the midst of a major cancer epidemic, and I have no doubt, and I have documented the basis for this, that industry is largely responsible for this overwhelming epidemic of cancer, in which 1 in every 2 men get cancer in their lifetimes, and 1 in every 3 women get cancer in their lifetimes.
See, this is the point where, well, one of the points where you get this kind of cursor thing, and graphically, this is I think, a really brilliant way to get at this notion that, you know, you could take any of a world of examples to illustrate the kinds of points that we're trying to make about the corporation. And importantly, we're trying to show that it is the corporation as an institution that's psychopathic. We're not saying it's any particular corporation. We're not saying it's the people within corporations. We're not saying that every behavior a corporation does is psychopathic. What we're saying is that the very constitution of the corporation, its very personality that's been legally created, that's what's psychopathic. That its institutional imperatives and directives and rules and principles create a psychopathic being.
Through their teeth. The files described areas of chronic inflammation in the heart, lung, kidney, spleen, also reproductive effects, also a whole series of other problems.
The most comprehensive independent assessment of the drug concludes that BST results in unnecessary pain, suffering, and distress for the cows. This is not acceptable for a drug designed simply to increase milk production.
It is a silly product. We have the industrial world is awash in milk. We're overproducing milk. We actually have governments around the world who pay farmers not to produce milk. So the first product Monsanto comes up with is a product that produces more of what we don't need.
Of course, you'll want to inject Posilac to every eligible cow, as each cow not treated is a lost income opportunity.
But the problem was that use of the artificial hormone caused all kinds of problems for the cows. It caused something called mastitis, which is a very painful infection of the udders. When you milk the cow, if the cow has bad mastitis, some of the, and I don't know how to say this in a, you know, I hope people aren't watching at dinner time, but the pus from the infection of the udders ends up in the milk, and the somatic cell count, they call it, the bacteria count inside your milk goes up.
There's a cost to the cows. The cows get sicker when they're injected with RBGH. They're injected with antibiotics. We know that people are consuming antibiotics through their food, and we know that that's contributing to antibiotic-resistant bacteria and diseases. And we know we're at a crisis when somebody can go into a hospital and get a staph infection and it can't be cured and they die. That's a crisis.
Bad for the cow, bad for the farmer, bad potentially for the consumer. The jury is out. We see a lot of conflicting evidence about potential health risks. And of course, as a consumer, my belief is, why should I take any risk?
Factory farm cows have not been the only.
Some people have commented that this sort of litany of horrible examples, I mean, the cows with mastitis, the possibility of consumers getting sick from the milk, the over-chemicalization of our society, the cancer epidemic, Agent Orange, sweatshops, it just goes on, and it's hard. It's hard to watch it all, and it is depressing in some respects, but I think it's also necessary. I mean, what we're up against in making a film like this and writing the book, is a PR industry that has spent billions of dollars and spends billions of dollars to try to convey an image of the corporation as this kind of warm and fuzzy being of this benevolent, caring, like a good neighbor. State Farm is there, and Ronald McDonald, and all these very sort of happy and benevolent images. And what's interesting is, if you look back historically, this kind of corporate image advertising really goes back to the early part of the 20th century. The corporation really began to emerge as a large and powerful institution at that time. There was, in the late part of the 19th and early part of the 20th century, what was come to be known as a merger mania in North America. So a lot of little corporations sort of all merged and became several very large corporations. AT&T was one of the largest at the time. And there was a lot of public concern about this, a lot of dissent within the labor movement and among citizens generally, that corporations were becoming more powerful than they should, and that they were overwhelming community institutions, church, government, and other aspects of civil society. And around 1906, AT&T launched what is probably the first true corporate image advertising campaign. And what they did is they put out all these magazine ads and whatnot, basically tried to show that corporations were these friendly, benevolent beings. And PR people at the time were aware that they had to do this, that they had to change people's image of what the corporation is. And they really haven't looked back since 1906. There was another sort of wave of what was called the new capitalism in the post-World War I period, where large companies like Eastman Kodak and Goodyear and all these other companies began to act nicer to their employees, partly in response to a more militant labor movement at the time and concerns about Bolshevism in the aftermath of World War I. So you had returning veterans from World War I who had basically almost sacrificed their lives or their limbs for their country, and then they're being treated like garbage in their jobs. And so there was a lot of concern about that in the labor movement, and corporations started to try to appear more benevolent and take various measures that made them seem such, to the point where there was this sort of ethos of that, capitalism is changing, it's becoming nicer. And that happened again in the 1930s after the crash of the stock market. Many people blamed corporations and corporate excess for that. And so again, you had this, mea culpa, and that's really the beginning of corporate social responsibility. You get a lot of people talking about corporate social responsibility, and a lot of people, business leaders, saying, we need to become socially responsible, because if we don't, then government's going to start regulating us. And so this notion that the corporate is benevolent is a notion that really goes back almost as far as to the origins of the modern large business corporation itself. And I think what we really wanted to do in this film, at least a major motivation of mine, was to do a bit of a reality check and to say, look, this is what the corporation is really about. And if there's one thing, if there's one purpose in the book and the film underlying it all, it's to try to create a realistic sense of what the corporation is, to try to combat this very one-sided sense that's been created and inculcated by the PR industry for the last 100 years or so. And it's funny, a lot of people say, well, your film isn't balanced. I mean, you don't give both sides. You just sort of show the critical side. And, I'd be happy to make a balanced film the day that, in that sense, the day that, Burst and Marsteller decides that they'll show both sides of the PR they're putting out about the corporations they represent. I don't believe that when you're developing a critical thesis, when you're trying to reveal certain flaws in a system, especially against the backdrop of 100 years worth of PR that tries to basically hide all of those things, I don't believe that kind of project where you're trying to reveal things that have been hidden requires that you kind of neutrally show both sides of the story. I mean, if you're doing a project about poverty, I don't think that you're required to also talk about how much wealth there is. You're focusing on a problem. you're directing your analytical insights at revealing a problem that other people aren't revealing. And so balance becomes a question of trying to be as fair as you possibly can in your criticism, and we did that. We interviewed people from both sides of the fence. Milton Friedman is in there as well as Noam Chomsky. We have CEOs, and we let them say their piece. We have Michael Walker. But there's no question that the project, both the book and the film, have a point of view. And what we try to do is develop that point of view in as rigorous a way as possible, as fair, as honest a way as possible. And to me, that's what balance means in the context of doing a point of view documentary or writing a point of view book. It doesn't mean that you're required to do what the nightly news does, which is to take a kind of neutral stance and just let each side speak for itself.
Every life support system of Earth is in decline, and these together constitute the biosphere. The biosphere that supports and nurtures all of life, and not just our life, but perhaps 30 million other species that share this planet with us. The typical company of the 20th century, extractive, wasteful, abusive, linear in all of its processes, taking from the earth, making, wasting, sending its products.
Ray Anderson is really an interesting character in this film. For many people who have watched the film, he emerges as the true hero of the film. And I think there are two ways to understand the Ray Anderson story, a right way and a wrong way. The wrong way, I think, to understand the Ray Anderson story, but unfortunately the way I think a lot of people do, is that what Ray Anderson shows is that there's hope for business people to have epiphanies like he did, realize that they're operating in a bad way, and voluntarily become good guys like he did. And that somehow what the Ray Anderson story says is that the solution to all the problems we raise in the film and in the book really lies with CEOs becoming good guys out of their own sort of sense of enlightenment. I think that is not the message that we intend to convey through Ray Anderson, and I don't believe it's the message that Ray Anderson intends to convey. I think it's really important when Ray Anderson says that in the future people like me will be put in jail. In other words, people like him who have been involved in plundering the earth, as he says, who have been involved in destroying the biosphere, as he says, will be put in jail. What he means by that, the implication of that, is that in the future the rules will be different, that in the future it will be illegal to plunder the earth, that in the future the laws and the legal system will have changed and will have become much tougher on corporations and will have become much more robust in protecting public interest from what corporations do. In other words, in the future, we as a society, all of us as citizens, will have created an order that puts corporations in a much smaller box in terms of their room to destroy the biosphere and to destroy the environment and to destroy society as a whole. To me, that's the message to take from Ray Anderson, and that's a very different message than relying on CEOs voluntarily to become good guys. I think what Ray Anderson is saying is that we as a society have to actually create rules to ensure that corporations act in socially responsible ways.